Today's scripture reading brings us to Romans chapter 2. Now, if you recall, Romans chapter 1 was speaking about the sinfulness of humanity and just how humanity itself is utterly depraved. And all of this is building up to, again, chapter 3 is the turning point. But here in chapter 2, the overarching theme of chapter 2 is that of judgment. And it's of judgment that's not just going to be upon the Gentiles. The Jews are not going to be spared from this judgment, but it's going to be upon the Jews as well. And Paul speaks a lot about what is a Jew, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But chapter 2 here, I have the first 5 verses labeled this, and that is no excuse for the self-righteous, because that's who he's addressing here, is those that think that they're something, those that think that they're above the judgment of God. They're not. And he addresses that there. They'll be without excuse when they stand before the Lord, because judgment is coming, verse number 5. And it's really amazing when you look at verse number 5, this word jumped out at me, and that was, after hardness and impenitent heart treasurest up unto thyself wrath. You know, I hope to be laying up treasures in heaven, and I hope as a Christian you are laying up treasures in heaven, but there's some that are laying up wrath. That's their treasure, that they will be being paid when they stand before the Lord. And in verse 6 through 11, I have that titled, Judgment Based on the Second Birth, Not the First. Because if you're not careful, if you want to take it out of context, what you'll do is when you look at verses 6 to 11, you can try to interpret that as Paul is saying that God is going to judge people based on their deeds or upon their works, and that's not true. In fact, if that's what he was teaching here in these 5 verses, it would fly in the face of everything else that he teaches throughout the book of Romans. That's not what he's doing. The key to biblical study, proper biblical hermeneutics, the first thing that you do is read it in context. And so when he's talking about here, the bookend is verses 6 and 11, who will render every man according to his deeds. Verse number 11, for there is no respect of persons with God. And he talks about the deeds of not what people do, but more so what is revealed, or what the converted man versus the unconverted man will put forth, the deeds in which will show within them. Because when you're reading it in context, remember what is prior to this is in chapter 1 is the sinfulness of humanity. The first part of chapter 2 is speaking about how the self-righteous will be judged, and in what comes after this is a comparison between the Jew and the Gentile. So when you read it in that context, you see that God's law is or judgment's not based on the first birth, whether you're a Jew physically or a Gentile physically, but upon the second birth and the characteristics in which what will show from one who has been born again. Verses 12 through 24, I have that titled God's Law in relation to the Jew and the Gentile, because he speaks of essentially 2 laws here, and that is the law of nature that's upon a man's heart, whether he be Jew or Gentile, and the law by command in which was given unto the Jews. All men are subject unto judgment, whether they be Jews and have the law by command, or whether they be Gentiles and have the law written upon their hearts. They're all subject to the judgment of God. And when man stands before the judgment of God, we will all be found wanting. I don't care who you are. And you have to understand, Paul is laying the groundwork, again, for chapter 3. I hate to keep kind of pointing to that, but it's all pointing to that. He's laying the groundwork for chapter 3. He's talking about how everyone's sinful and everyone will be judged. And the reason why all man will be guilty is found in verse number 16. It says this, in the day when God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. So it matters not if you put on an outward facade and you look holy unto your neighbor. God knows your heart, and that's whereby you will be judged. verses 25 through 29 to finish out chapter 2. I have that titled, Who is a Jew? Because in these verses, you see, Paul begins comparing what truly constitutes a Jew. Now, he's not talking about physically. He's giving the physical appearance of circumcision, but not because it is a physical trait, but because that was the seal of the covenant, of the old covenant. That's the mark of the old covenant. So he's not talking about a Jew physically, but he's talking about a Jew spiritually. That is what he is speaking of here. And what he's saying is, just because you're a Jew physically does not mean that you are one spiritually. It's not that you may have your flesh circumcised, but not your heart, and that's what God's looking at. And this is really directed towards the Jews, the majority of this chapter. The same can be said about Christians. There are so many people that have the label Christians. They think that they're Christians. They claim to be Christians. And they may be one because, in their eyes, because they've been baptized or because they take communion or whatever it is. But they're truly not. But why? Because there's been no change in their heart. And so that type of thing is what Paul is addressing here at the last part of chapter 2. So that's going to do it. It's, as I said, we could expound upon this and we could go over it and go over it. And I, myself, if I sat here and studied and taught out of this chapter for years, I would still never get to the bottom of it. There's just so much in this book. So I truly encourage you to study it out. And I promise you, you'll be blessed if you make the decision to do that. That being said, we are done for this lesson, and Lord willing, we'll see you tomorrow.